I think it's undone the American empire in a way that I don't think American empire will be able to bounce back. This is probably the most seismic shift, fundamental shift in regional order that we've seen in the last 30 years or so.
How bad could this have been?
Everyone knows you cannot change a regime from the air remotely. It's impossible. We always knew the Iranians had the capability, but it was never proven. And now it's been proven, it's been tested. And they don't need a nuclear weapon anymore to kind of impose their will on the rest of the world. Egypt is an unstable country, and it has become a beggar state in many ways because of the Sisi regime, a beggar state that is taking money and begging for money from Qatar, from UAE, from Saudi.
How does Israel stop itself from, walking into destruction?
Israel is just a hammer that sees everything as a nail. Everything has to be hammered, hammered, hammered. And you have a problem, you deal with it through coercion, not through consensus.
Are there any other spoilers? What's the UAE's thoughts on this? Who else do you see trying to spoil this what could be a very new vision of the region?
I do think moving forward, the Israel lobby is strategically weakened. Thereby, their vision for the Middle East that has been imposed on Washington is weakened. The battle between Israel and the Gulf lobby, that is going to determine Middle Eastern policy going forward. And the Gulf lobby, if acting collectively, and as they have now towards the end of this conflict, is more powerful than the Israel lobby, more sustainable, because, as I said, it was built on consensus rather than just transactionalism. I've been to South Africa many times. I found it a very fascinating country.
It's beautiful. It is
but
fascinating.
Beautiful, but it's also fascinating.
It's fascinating.
It's unique
yes.
socio-politically.
So interesting. Yeah. Yes.
There's all the tribal element to it,
Yeah.
and then there is a class problem to
Yes.
it. There is a ethnic problem, sectarian problem, every sort of problem you can think of.
Things.
I mean,
There's
from a social scientist point of view,
no, it's beautiful.
fascinating.
No, but also what it's done is, and we like growing up, I didn't realize it, and I didn't realize it for a long time. But it also means that we artistically are very interesting, and from a food perspective, we're very interesting, and we're interesting in so many ways. It's a pretty cool place. Okay, we good? 3, 2, 1. Hi, good day. Welcome to another episode of Unapologetic, and I'm very pleased to have in studio with me again, speaking to him for the 4th time, but in studio for the 3rd time, Andreas Krieg. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me again.
Again, yes, Andreas, and I spoke to you, I said in the elevator we were discussing, and I'm going to say this again, in the elevator we were discussing the fact that you've been here now for your 3rd time. This is our 4th discussion, and when you first came here, it was November last year. We discussed Sudan and the UAE's involvement in Sudan. And then 2 months later, we discussed the Cold War between the UAE and Saudi Arabia. 3 months ago, it was a week into, it was 3 months ago. It was a week or 2 weeks into the US and Israeli attack on Iran. And now there seems to be a very tangible ceasefire in place. And by many analysts' sort of analysis, Israel has strategically been defeated quite systematically in this war. And Iran have come out quite well. And there seems to be, I mean, this was always probably going to be the long arc, but there seems to be there's been a catalyst to a shift in regional order. Let's discuss that.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts?
Right. First thing that you said already is this is probably the most seismic shift, fundamental shift in regional order that we've seen in the last 30 years or so. I think it's a continuation of what happened in Iraq in 2003. I think it's undone the American empire in a way that I don't think American empire will be able to bounce back, nor is there a willingness for Washington or the Gulf or the Arab world in general for America to bounce back. And it's now very tangible in a way that there are good reasons now for the US to not wanting to come back to the Middle East. It's not just America first, it's not just MAGA. There are so many quagmires the Americans gotten involved in. The bill is rising in terms of the cost of the war, the perception of this war across the political spectrum in Washington as well. A realization in the Gulf that America is no longer a provider of security, that they're unable to provide. More than that they're a liability, that even the bases that they put there have actually become magnets of attacks rather than deterrents of attacks, which I think is another fundamental problem. The idea that the Gulf already invested trillions of dollars in the United States to keep Trump happy, and then still, despite all of this, we're unable to stop this war from happening. And I think we said a couple of months ago, I said that the neoconservatives won this round of the battle together with the Israel lobby. I think that what we see now for the last 2 months or so is MAGA coming back and the Gulf lobby coming back of saying, look, this can't continue. I do think moving forward, the Israel lobby is strategically weakened, thereby their vision for the Middle East that has been imposed on Washington is weakened. Equally, the Gulf lobby is on the rise. Equally, MAGA is on the rise, and their vision for the Middle East moving forward is going to be the dominant one, not just with this administration, but even with the next administration. And so there is a fundamental shift ongoing, and nobody has any answers of where this is going. There was always the idea that we have US hegemony, that the US is a superpower that's able and willing to provide security collectively for everyone in the region, for Israel as much as for the Arab world. That's no longer the case. And nobody really has a plan B. Obviously, Gulf states for probably 15 years or so, at least since the Arab Spring, were quite adamant that they needed to diversify away their security, their ability to sustain their resilience and their ability to basically continue surviving and building prosperity, not just relying on this single source of failure, which has been now the United States. But it hasn't been enough. That diversification has been mostly narrative. If you actually now, during this war, it became quite obvious how overly reliant, how entangled the Gulf states are with the United States. And so what we're doing now is, what we see now is there's two levels. One level is a war of a narrative, I think. Much of what we read in the media, most of the social media discourse is about narratives being spun by Iran, by the US, by the Gulf states, which isn't the reality. It's people expressing their aspirations and their ideals and their ambitions of where they want the region to go. But that's actually despite the fact that deep inside, they're already realizing that this order that they had prior to this war is not coming back. The idea that the UAE, for example, was saying, we're doubling down on the United States, the future is with the United States and Israel, doesn't represent how they're acting on the ground. It's quite the opposite. I think under the table, despite the fact that the narrative has been about defiance and coercion and deterrence, not just in the UAE, but also other Gulf states vis-a-vis Iran, that narrative doesn't hold up when you see what they've been doing for the last 4 weeks or so. All of the Gulf states have been reaching out quietly or not so quietly to the Iranians, to trying to build their own peace, knowing that the US is not going to be there to defend them. I think we're seeing more of an integration, hopefully integration and entanglement with the Iranians, the understanding that they're all prisoners of geography as well, that the US is somewhere 10,000 miles in this direction, but actually Iran is 100 miles on the other side. So we have to find some sort of common ground. So that war of a narrative seems to distract where we're actually going, what's actually happening. And for some, the UAE is a great example again. The UAE is so obsessed with the narrative that they actually have very little in terms of policy to offer. They're obsessed with that narrative, and the narrative has become almost a replacement for policy. And it's also, very much testimony to the fact that none of the states in the region have a good plan B. There isn't an alternative plan B, and there is not going to be a new order in place. So we're going from some sort of crumbling order, because I'm not pretending that the US order was in a good state prior to this war. It was already in decline. It was certainly in decline since the Arab Spring. I'd say it's probably in decline since the Iraq War in 2003 for more than 20 years. But now it's become so tangible that you cannot ignore it. And there isn't a Russia or a China coming in trying to help them out. There isn't an extra regional protector. And there's the fear in the Gulf that, or let's say since the 7th of October, there's been the fear that there is an Israeli military hegemony that will dictate the terms and the pace of conflict in the region. Now there is this other realization that Iran is a bit appearing, at least in the Gulf region, as a hegemon, able to inflict pain, able to coerce and deter as they see fit. And so if you're in the Gulf, if you're in the Arab world, you're somewhat wedged between these two pariahs, Iran and Israel, with which you can't really build a good relationship. And so are you coming up with your own new order, because the US is not going to be there? So I think where we are now is a mess of multipolarity where no single a country is able to dictate the terms and outcomes of conflicts in the region. And so it's a network-centric flux of organic order that constantly changes. And hence why we could have this talk every week, and we'll probably come up with another iteration of this order, because it's constantly evolving. And this mess, unpredictability that comes with it, is highly problematic, because it really goes to the heart of, or undermines the heart of, how the Gulf states look at security and stability.
Okay, so you started off by saying this is arguably the biggest shift, the biggest seismic shift in the region in about 30 years. And most likely the U.S. empire now is clearly in retreat. I mean, they're both statements, but they are substantiated, and you've substantiated them. But I just want to speak a bit about Israel, because obviously there's a many analysts believe, many thinkers think that Israel kind of reluctantly, not they weren't reluctant, but they took the U.S. reluctantly into this war. Obviously, the U.S. has had an anti-imperial geopolitical strategy against Iran, but Israel kind of forced their hand to a large extent. There was a likelihood. You weren't someone who was espousing this likelihood from the discussion we had when the war just started. But there was a likelihood, and I'm sure you would have given credits to the likelihood, and it may still happen, that 3 or 4 weeks into the war, people were thinking this could get really, really bad, because there was some serious infrastructure damage been put on the Iranians. Trump was tweeting out things that were about destroying civilization. We do know that the Israelis, from what they've done in Gaza, from what they've done in Lebanon, from what they've been doing to the Palestinians over 75 years, from what they were doing in Iran at the time 2 months ago, would have done anything. Could have, people were discussing the nuclear option. But even without the nuclear option, the fact that there was a real insistence from the Israelis, and as their proxy in this instance, the US, to maybe bring down the regime or infiltrate the state with militias, etc., that this could have gotten really, really ugly. And now it seems like Iran's government has stood strong. The region has, to a large extent, are now back channeling with them, as they've said. How bad, I think, because we're talking about empire and power. So when we try to analyze victories, it's not necessarily just 5% more, but it's the fact that things are now so different compared to how bad they could have been. How bad could this have been if it went the other way?
I don't think there was any. If you would have to build a scenario tree on the 27th of February, just before this started, in terms of how things could have ended up, the only way this could have been slightly better for Israel and the neoconservatives is a scenario is a scenario that probably has a probability, or had a probability then, of like 10 to 20% at most. And it would have required a full mobilization of groups, networks within Iran who were protesting already in January. That was a very low likelihood at the time, because what happened in January couldn't have just been replicated by the end of February, because the regime had imposed such an immense cost on the people, killing tens of thousands of people. The sort of deterrent effect that was established in January meant that these same people were now no longer able or willing to move, even as US-Israeli air power was in the air. So the idea that regime change could be established from the air, that idea is like, we've been teaching this in Staff College for the last 30 years. Since the 1990s, everyone who teaches operations for any Air Force sort of leadership, command structure, everyone knows you cannot change a regime from the air remotely. It's impossible. So you needed to have some boots on the ground. There weren't any boots on the ground available. The idea that the Israelis were selling to Trump was we have networks all over. Mossad has infiltrated the civil society. We're able to just switch on the switch, and suddenly people will start running, mobilizing, and will take up arms and fight the regime. And that was obviously a complete miscalculation on the Israeli side. Equally, the idea that you would be able to mobilize Kurds and Baluchis and minorities inside Iran against Tehran, just considering the strategic depth, the sheer size of Iran, that was not a viable option. The Kurds themselves are not united. The Kurds very early on in Iraq were saying, we don't want to be any part of it. And it seems like whenever there's a problem, the Americans are saying, okay, well, we might have some Kurdish force somewhere that we can mobilize. But that was not even happening. And if you then look at the Kurds in Iran, if you look at the numbers, there were maybe a few thousand fighters that would have been able to mobilize against a state, a network state like Iran, which is kind of the RGC is a militia with a state. If you look at that, 1 million people under arms that they can mobilize against a few thousand people from the Kurds and a few thousand Baluchis, that was never going to be the force to topple the regime. So how bad could it have been? I think it was quite clear in the first week or two that this was going into a war of attrition, of degradation, where yes, air power did a lot of damage, and it was immense. The amount of sorties, the amount of ordnance dropped by the US and Israel collectively or combined against Iran is immense. The damage done to infrastructure is very impressive. So on a tactical level, very impressive conduct of an operation. the big question with strategy is always how do you translate that tactical win into a strategic political outcome that gets you to your theory of success. And there wasn't a theory of success. There wasn't a plan of how to convert these tactical gains into a political outcome. And so how bad could it have been? We could have had more bombing. We could have had, and that was a kind of outlier scenario. That's a scenario that pretty much still stands now. It's completely unrealistic. Even if you'd asked me in February, I'd probably give it less than 5%. I think I'd give it even less than that today, is the scenario of putting boots on the ground, large-scale boots. And even then, big question mark of whether this would have really made a material difference on the ground. And if we talk about boots on the ground, whether it's in Banda or Bus, there's been talk over the last 4 months of putting boots on the ground, seizing the IRGC naval infrastructure there, or Hague Island, and we've had all kinds of islands being thrown into the mix. We would have had to look at, upwards of 500,000 boots on the ground. That would be a full commitment of the collective, of the whole spectrum of U.S. military power to conduct an operation against what I would consider a peripheral threat to U.S. interests, Iran. It is a threat, but it's a peripheral threat that would have, considering that in the biggest scheme of great power competition vis-a-vis Russia and particularly China, that you are committing the whole collection of U.S. military power, the whole bandwidth to this one conflict, completely unrealistic, certainly for a MAGA president. And even then I would have said, even if you're able to take Tehran, this entire IRGC infrastructure is built around insurgency. It would have been a war or an insurgency so much worse than what we experienced in Iraq in 2003 or in Afghanistan. So how that would have really made a material difference on the ground, big question mark. And as I said, extremely unlikely, way too costly. So there weren't any good military options because regime change is always not a good option. Regime change is not something, if you do it through coercion only, you will not be able to sustain and succeed. And also we had a rallying around the flag moment that a lot of people who might have been protesting in January were then coming out, not in support of the regime, but in support of Iran. So you actually created the opposite effect. The Gulf states, I mean, that was what the other thing where the Israelis were trying to get the Gulf states involved. There was this sort of idea of a slippery slope where they tried to defend themselves and thereby inevitably coming along the Israeli war effort and supporting the Israeli war effort, giving it legitimacy, giving it bandwidth, and thereby creating a sort of a new front in this war. Would it have made a difference? I don't think so. It would have been, they're collectively, it's quite impressive what the GCC can put on the table militarily, but would it have made a difference? I don't think so. So in terms of how much worse could it have gotten? Yes, a nuclear bomb, which, the Israelis are crazy. They're unhinged, of course, especially this Netanyahu government. I don't want to, if you look at the rhetoric of Ben Gvir and Smotrich, you clearly see that they're unwell as a country. But would they've used nuclear weapons? Very unlikely. And even if, you nuke Tehran, you nuke some of the urban centers, would it have broken the will of the IRGC network state to resist? I would say no. So ultimately, then it could have been just more force, more ordnance dropped, more people killed, more infrastructure destroyed. And I don't think without a significant, sizable boot on the ground to hold and seize territory for an extensive period of time, the regime would have not caved.
When I spoke to you in I think it was the January discussion, it was when there were protests happening, and we discussed what would be the likelihood of the US trying to instill regime change. At that time, it wasn't, not through war, but through some other stand. And what do they want? What do they want from Iran? And you mentioned that from your perspective, the US is looking for the IRGC, elements of the IRGC to start dealing with it in a way which was different to what the IRGC's dealt with it previously, in the sense that they're looking for, possibly to lift sanctions because the IRGC could profit from that and then remain in place and become actually a new market, not just for the US, but for the Gulf, etc. Right, now taking that analysis into, let's keep it and park it there. And now there's a new reality to some extent in Iran. What's the new reality now? Because now, Ali Khamenei has been killed. There's definitely a shift in whatever leadership faction was in charge to now, right? Whether it's big or small, let's discuss that. But what now, in terms of the IRGC and where they stand and what they now are looking for, other than the fact that they want a lasting peace deal, right? What's at stake for them now?
You think the IRGC wants a lasting peace deal? Because
I mean, possibly, because I think fighting all the time could be problematic.
yeah, well, peace deal means they don't want to continue fighting, but they
Yes.
also don't want to. I think they're quite happy with a limbo state for an extended period of time, which makes it very bad, where the sort of state we're in. Because here you have a Trump administration with no patience, an impulsive man surrounded by sycophants, and you'd be surprised to see how much of a micromanager Trump is in the negotiation even. You'd think he delegated that to J.D. Vance. That's not the truth. That's not the truth. Ultimately, it's still Donald Trump who micromanages it. So his perception very much matters. And he's never been, I mean, if you look at his art of the deal, which is, it's a joke really, if you look what has been achieved or not achieved in Iran, it's like the opposite of the art of surrender in many ways. But, he's up against the IRGC and an Iranian bazaar mentality, if you will. And I'm not saying that in a derogative way. It's the idea that everything is up for negotiation, right? The price is not agreed until you sign the contract, and you might never sign a contract. That it's stalling. It's also the ability of them not to say no, because that's part of the negotiation tactic, right? They're not going to say no. They say yes. Why not? We're quite happy to meet. But that meeting could go. You might be in a spiral. Or in a loop of never-ending conversation around the same topic without ever coming to a resolution, because it keeps it buys them time, it buys them momentum, and it's also an extremely complex state. And I always describe Iran as a network state. It's not hierarchical in the sense that Saddam's Iraq was, or even the UAE are in many ways. It's not authoritarian. It is authoritarian in that way, but not in terms of. There's not one omnipotent man. It's not an autocracy.
There isn't a supreme leader.
There is a supreme leader, but he's one hub of power that's surrounded, like a satellite, by smaller hubs of power that all report to that sort of idea of the supreme leader. When we can talk about Mujtaba Khamenei as a supreme leader, which has been somewhat in hiding for the last 4 months. So he has an impact over negotiations, but. Ultimately, what they have to do is they have to find consensus within to then go and negotiate. And it's not Arakchi and Ghalibaf who I think have, in pretty much, from what I hear from negotiators, have really negotiated in earnest and, in good faith and, with trust. These guys are just the front of a very, very diverse spectrum of opinions in Iran, and different hubs of power having different interests, even within the IRGC. So Wahidi is certainly, as the new IRGC chief, one of the most powerful men in the country, but he himself has to manage a network of different entities and opinions and ideologies within the IRGC. We always talk about hardliners and less hardliners. I mean, this is a country of hardliners, harder liners, and hardest liners. There isn't any soft liners anymore in Iran. And that there is a collection of different opinions of whether you even should negotiate with the United States. Because, for 50 years nearly, they've been, the big Satan has been the United States. Now you're meeting directly with them and you're potentially making concessions. And there are some who say we should stay in this permanent state of procrastination, because procrastination is what Iranian negotiation has always been about. If you look at the long process that got us to the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal in 2015, you see that there was stalling, procrastination, deference, and ultimately you got to a deal after a long process. And at that time, it was the Omanis who were hosting it. And this, if you look at the mindset of Iran, and you're then looking at Donald Trump, who anyway only has two and a half years left in office, the Iranians they might just play on time and say, let's see how long this goes. But I want to say that there is a unique opportunity, and there are some in the IRGC who realize that, and that goes back to the thing I said when we last spoke in January about the idea that the IRGC, or that even the United States giving the IRGC, making the Iranians an offer that is so good, is better than any offer I think the Iranians have received in the last 50 years. An offer that ultimately sees a comprehensive deal about the nuclear issue, a comprehensive deal over some sort of containment of capabilities, but not surrendering capabilities. This is not a dictate of Versailles. This is not a complete surrender of the Iranians, obviously. But there is a scenario where people in the administration around J.D. Vance, even Kushner and Witkov and others, believe that there is a potential to build a gateway into a market that is untapped, the biggest market in the region by far in terms of consumers, a highly sophisticated market with massive human capital, probably more sophisticated human capital than you would get in any other country in the region. And large, massive size. Obviously, people always focus on the energy sector. There's so much more. There's science, there's tech. And the Iranians have been able to maintain this despite the fact that they've been under the most cruel sanction regime for decades. And so lifting sanctions, opening up that market, opening it up to outside investors. I'm not saying that lifting sanctions will immediately bring trillions of dollars into the economy, but you can build up. And if that opening up comes gradually, there is an immense potential for the Iranians and this regime, for the IRGC in particular, which runs most of the economy, to profit from this, build an economy that serves the people, serves itself, keeps itself in power, and build an Iran that is probably more powerful than it has been for a century. And so and this is why I'm thinking there must be some in the RGC who understand that this could be at the end of this process. I think this is a massive incentive that people downplay and say, "Oh, this never going to happen." And this is a U.S. administration that wants out. I think Trump has been, what he's made in terms of concessions for this MOU is quite remarkable. It's all, everyone, the Israelis, but also on the left, people say, "Oh, that's a surrender document." But I don't want to frame it that way because Trump doesn't like the sort of narrative of surrender. He certainly doesn't see it that way. It's also an opportunity for the Iranians. It's an opportunity for the United States. It's an opportunity for the region. Unless you sit in Israel, you probably see this as a massive opportunity now. But the idea is that you bring the Israelis in down the line once Iran has opened up and the economy is flourishing. So the IRGC should be in a position now to use this opportunity to build something. And this is why, for me, it's mind-boggling that there's some hardliners who think they shouldn't negotiate at all and just sit this one out. Because for the Iranians, yes, they've shown resilience, they're able to inflict pain on their neighbors, but to what extent, to what end, to what, what is it that they ultimately want to achieve? If you want to stay in your little medieval resistance mindset of resistance for the sake of resistance, because you are this perpetual historic, you have that long, a traumatic experience of being victimized by the rest of the world, which sits very deeply in Iranian strategic culture. If this is all you're going to worry about, very similar to Israel, by the way, this idea of victimhood and being victimized by the rest of the world, then that is a trauma that will hold you back. That makes you a terrible decision maker, terrible strategy maker, and it will undermine your ability to seize opportunities when they arise.
I mean, the mere fact that 40 leaders with Ali Khamenei was killed means that in all likelihood there's a younger crop of leaders who have less direct trauma from the revolution and from the Iran-Iraq war and all of the U.S. actions. So, I mean, I'm assuming you would agree that now that the likelihood of that deal from the Iranian side is more likely. And you mentioned that Trump only has 2.5 years. I mean, you never know with Trump; he may do something else. But let's assume there's someone else after Trump. There's either a Republican or a Democrat. Well, do you see them moving in the same direction towards something like it sounds like what you're saying is there's this direction that actors want to move to, which is, slowly becoming more friendly to Iran, giving them more breathing space, and with the IRGC being able to maintain their power, becoming more open, right? Do you think that momentum will continue?
It really depends. So the Israel lobby is not dead. They have, they've lost the battle. I don't think they've won. They've lost the war yet. I'm not talking about the Iran war, but in the biggest scheme of things, they're not giving up. And if you look at the tantrums that a lot of them are throwing on social media, a lot of their very prominent talking hats, you see that they're really doubling down on undermining the MOU and saying diplomacy is a terrible idea. Qatar as the chief mediator, terrible country. Pakistan, terrible country. Everyone who's trying to build peace, terrible. We want more war. And that's not just Netanyahu. Netanyahu is a very big part of it. But I think what happens in Washington is key. And if you look at the Israel lobby, the collective pro-Israel lobby, you're probably the most prominent figure in power, close to power right now, is Marco Rubio. And he went to the Gulf last week. And if you look at the meetings he had in Kuwait, Bahrain, and Abu Dhabi, it becomes quite clear that he has an alternative vision. He's not openly defying Trump, and he's not openly going against the sort of direction by the president and the vice president. But his narrative is much closer aligned with that of Israel. A lot more pessimism, a lot more, we can't trust the Iranians, and we need to build up deterrents, and we have to show force. And if the Iranians don't do X, Y, and Z, we will coerce them. He's very, very much the counter player to J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance is probably the most MAGA. He's been very quiet over the first 2-3 months of the war because he was very much opposed to it. He's probably the most genuine America First guy who believes in the sort of stuff that Tucker Carlson and a lot of the very prominent MAGA advocates in the United States are talking about. And he's someone, J.D. Vance, who's really embraced the process. And it's from what I'm hearing from Switzerland, he was, he was in good spirits to say, okay, we want out. And he sees the opportunities that could arise if the Iranians were actually following Ghalibaf and Arakchi. They are just, obviously, as I said, they're just the front of this much more complex regime. If you then look at Marco Rubio, he is someone on the other side of the spectrum. And he's likely, with the way he's putting himself out there and the narratives he's pushing out there, he seems to be positioning himself as a potential candidate for presidency in 2028. And if we have, and it's very unlikely because ultimately it's the vice president who will run. It would be very unusual for Marco Rubio to challenge him. But the pro-Israel lobby has, many things that's been said by some of the prominent talking heads. It's like when J.D. Vance made these remarks about Israel, people were saying, on the pro-Israel lobby, were saying this was the mistake of his lifetime. That's the end of his career. A lot of people said that, basically quite confident that they're able to ruin his reputation. I don't think there's much to J.D. Vance that the Israelis could use to potentially undermine his reputation so badly that he is not going to get a ticket to run. But there is internal friction within that administration. If a Marco Rubio type, if J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio running on together, unlikely. But the sort of Marco Rubio types are a threat to this process because they're new conservatives. They like the Israeli. They've internalized the Israeli idea of fighting because for survival, and it's very similar to the hardliners in Iran. Fighting for survival is the only option, and we're going back to war. For now, I think J.D. Vance is in a good position. Donald Trump, as I said, micromanaging, is still on site. If the Iranians are not entirely stupid to undermine it, and a lot of the stuff that happened over the last 4 or 5 days suggests the Iranians are quite stupid. They don't never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. Then we are on a maybe not very linear, but we're on a trajectory that should lead us to some sort of agreement. I don't think in 60 days, but in the next 2.5 years.
2.5 years, that's a long time. Who are the other spoilers? So you've mentioned the Israelis, you've mentioned Marco Rubio, and the neoconservative element within, the state of the White House, the hardliners within the RJ, the hardliners of the hardliners in the IRGC. Are there any other spoilers? What's the UAE's thoughts on this? Who else do you see trying to spoil this what could be a very new vision of the region?
Look, neoconservatives in general are a problem. And they don't just exist in Washington and in Israel. They do exist in Abu Dhabi as well. The UAE has made a very interesting metamorphosis, or has gone through a very interesting transformation in terms of rhetoric and also action. There's been an internal friction between MBZ and Tahnoun bin Zayed, the UAE president and the national security advisor, two brothers who have kind of different visions for how to tame Iran. The MBZ one was about defiance, coercion, deterrence. The Tahnoun bin Zayed approach has been one of engagement, entanglement, doing a bit of what they've done already before, of trying to, if Iran has enough of a stake in the survival of the UAE because they can use it for getting access to financial markets and whatnot, then they have less of an incentive to attack the UAE. I think Tahnoun won this battle, and he certainly changed the rhetoric and the stance and the posture of the UAE. But MBZ is very much a neoconservative. I don't think they're in a process of spoiling, but they're just, again, there is the biggest sort of test for this MOU right now, apart from Lebanon, I think is the Strait of Hormuz. For the Gulf states, certainly is. And what we've seen over the last couple of days. So in Lebanon, I think it's quite clear that the Israelis are the main spoiler. In the Strait of Hormuz, it's the Iranians who are the main spoiler. And there are certain elements within the IRGC who don't want to honor the MOU. We've seen the Omanis trying to establish a southern route of passage through the Strait of Hormuz, through their sovereign waters, which is their right. And the Iranians attacked tankers that were going through that southern route as a form of deterrence, undermining confidence in the market and so on and so forth. That is not in keeping with what was discussed in Switzerland last week. It is very much, and that goes back to the point I made earlier, just because you have Ghalibaf and Arakshi on site, there are elements in the naval component of the IRGC who think it's a bad idea, and that sovereignty in the Strait of Hormuz is not just on paper, but it has to be established, and it has to be established by force if necessary. This sort of coercive approach. That is something that will obviously really gives fuel to MBZ's vision and, new conservatives there, but also fuels anger in the rest of the GCC. And that is something that I think we shouldn't underestimate. But apart from that, I think the Europeans have an interest for this too, because they will be the ones who bear the burden of whatever comes out of the Strait of Hormuz. Whatever sort of regime we're going to put on the Strait of Hormuz will affect European customers more than anyone else, because we're so reliant, as well as obviously Asian markets. But the Asians have found a way, especially the Chinese, to negotiate and engage the Iranians. The Europeans don't. So again, Asians, Europeans have an interest in resolving this issue. Americans have an interest in resolving this issue. It's really Israelis, and in Israel, it's not just some hardliners. I think there is. I think there was a poll last week where people say how many people are in favor of this MOU. I think it was less than 10%. So 90% of people in Israel oppose this MOU. Think it's a bad idea, whether they're liberal or far right or whatever. And so this is not a Bibi Netanyahu issue. And if Netanyahu gets voted out in the end, in the autumn of this year, whoever's going to come next is likely going to continue on that trajectory. So I think Israel is a major problem. Lebanon is a major problem. And then you've got the IRGC elements who are also going to do whatever they think they can get away with, which is quite a lot, as it seems. And so these are the two main spoilers in all of this.
Okay, so you mentioned the Straits of Hormuz, and it sounds like it's a deliberate tactic of maybe deliberate's a bit of a weird word, because I do see there's ambiguity behind what's behind the negotiators from Iran's perspective, right? But and then you've also mentioned 2.5 years in terms of getting a deal. So it seems like there's.
I'm saying 2.5 years because that's how long Trump has in office.
No, which is what I mapped with, right? So it's clear that it sounds like there's a view in Tehran that prolonging the negotiations and keeping ambiguity around Hormuz is empowering for them. Mm-hmm. Explain if that is so. Explain why that is so.
Well, the MOU is full of ambiguity. How are you going to resolve 50 years of conflict in 14 points on a 2-pager? You're not. And there's been a lot of back and forth of the 2 weeks before the MOU was announced over wording and phrasing and commas and all that sort of stuff. But it needed a degree of ambiguity for both sides to actually come around the table. And that was the difficult thing. We went from a high-intensity conflict with a massive sort of strategic underbelly. I mean, if you look at a conflict is like an iceberg. What you see, the issues, which are the tip of the iceberg. The 90% of the iceberg under the waterline is all these unresolved issues that you don't see. And you kind of, with this peace deal, address all of it. You're trying to address all the stuff under the waterline as well. It's not just the issue of this war. It's not just the issue of Lebanon or the issue of Hormuz. And that is extremely ambitious. So I think the Qataris have made a very, very good effort in trying to build, and that's their diplomacy of small steps, of saying, let's try to get them around the table, agree to a framework, make it ambiguous in certain areas. That ambiguity will obviously be problematic because both sides have different interpretations of what this entails. And if you read the point on the Strait of Hormuz, there is ambiguity about it. And freedom of navigation, yes. But the Iranians saying we are ensuring freedom of navigation, but on our terms and through our channels. And some people in Iran are saying this is within the confines of the MOU. But the Qataris knew that you needed to keep it as broad, as ambiguous, as wide, and then fill it with the gaps with content. And that's where the smaller working groups and deconfliction cells that are now meeting in Doha are coming in, doing it more in secret, with subject matter experts being involved. It's a far more professional way for the Qataris to approach this than what they've done in previous years. The Qataris have made an immense, in terms of capacity building, that what they've built in this diplomatic process has been quite impressive. And so this is not just improvising. This is very strategic, very, very procedural as well. The problem with that ambiguity is that the Iranians knew they were signing up to something that they could fill with content as they see fit. And now what they're trying to do with the Strait of Hormuz is they're just trying to, through coercion, to impose their will, through aggression, imposing their will on the GCC. And it undermines all 6 of the Gulf states plus Iraq's interests, because all of them are abutting states to the Persian Gulf, and all of them have, for them, the Strait of Hormuz is the artery to get to the global economy. They all have an interest in it. Ideally, and there's been a lot of different models being thrown around of how this management could look like. This management in an equitable way would be one where certainly the sovereignty of the actual waterway of the Strait of Hormuz is between Iran and Oman. That's very clear. But then as soon as you get out of it, you get into the Gulf of Oman or you're going into the Persian Gulf, you are seeing you have all these other actors who are also abutting states to it, who have an interest in it and I think should be stakeholders and should be brought in. And I think there are some in Iran who are entertaining the idea that there might be a sort of Persian, how they're calling it now, Persian Strait of Hormuz management company mechanism, whatever they want to call it, which organizes the actual transit, where they keep the security, they make sure that insurance is there, that that environmental protection is guaranteed, all that sort of stuff. But at the same time, you're also making the other ones stakeholders, because security around this passage involves the Persian Gulf and the Strait of and the Omani and the Gulf of Oman. That means the GCC states, Iraq and Iran, are all stakeholders in that passage, in that waterway, one way or the other. And so a mechanism should involve all of them. And there's some in Iran, there's certainly some in the Gulf, and the countries have thought about it as well, of saying let's split the money that's being collected through that mechanism of the Strait of Hormuz, where a lion's share goes to Oman and Iran because they're the stakeholders, but the rest of the fees might be shared across the other 5 GCC countries plus Iraq. That would be something that I think all sides could live with. And there are some in the IRGC who say absolutely not. Sovereignty of the Strait of Hormuz means we dictate the terms. We can close it, and it's basically choke point capability, choke point power. They want to use this as a choke point, and they will use aggression to enforce their will to do that. And we've seen it. And I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't get a green light from the very top last week of firing onto that tanker. That is likely, because that's something we've seen in this war as well, delegation to the tactical level, where on the tactical level, IRGC commanders have quite a lot of autonomy to make decisions as they see fit. And there's some of the IRGC who also see this as a major money-making scheme, right? If they collect the fees, and some are saying the fees could be in the billions of dollars, some in Iran wish them to be in the billions of dollars, then this is something that will go through the IRGC Navy. They will collect it, and they might give some of it back to the central pot in Tehran, but a lot of the rest will stay in their own pockets. So for them, it's everything is a scheme. But I would also say, and this becomes clear if you look at how the mediation have progressed over that issue, is that the Iranians themselves, for them, it's not just about money. It's also about ego. It's about prestige, status. They want to be accredited as the main stakeholders, as the sovereign right holders over the passage of the Strait of Hormuz. It's not just collecting the fee or a toll, whatever you want to call it. It's saying we are the boss and we can impose our will. And so by that, and that is unfortunately the outcome of this war. We always knew the Iranians had the capability, but it was never proven. And now it's been proven, it's been tested, and they don't need a nuclear weapon anymore to kind of impose their will on the rest of the world. I think this is far more powerful, far more acceptable than the use of a nuclear weapon. It's far more powerful as a deterrent as well. And so the IRGC doesn't want to surrender it. But once it becomes a treaty, it becomes less legitimate. And so before this is formalized, they're really trying to test the boundaries. And the GCC ultimately will be the ones determining in what direction it goes and whether the negotiation will allow them to do this. I think Trump himself is not really in a position. He wants this issue to be over. It doesn't affect the U.S. economy that much. But I think any sort of solution Trump will be happy with. But it's the GCC who will have to stand up for the red lines.
Okay, so you've been talking a lot about the GCC in this last answer, and I want to move the focus to Saudi Arabia, but not yet. the initial thoughts as this war was occurring, and as we saw U.S. bases in the GCC countries, for now excluding Saudi Arabia, occur, there was this idea that these bases are a liability. It's clear now that these countries need a security pact with the U.S. and I mean not with the U.S., with Iran. And I think that's clear, and it's easy for someone seeing this and following it just a bit more than superficially to see why that trend would occur. From what you're saying at the same time, specifically with the Qataris and Omanis, while that's there's been deeper entrenchment in terms of negotiating with the US, and sort of they've always been, the Qataris have always had diplomacy and diplomatic ties with multiple people. But now, in order to ensure that they can still deal with Iran, they still need their own insurance, and the U.S. is obviously insurance for that. And it sounds like Qatar is deepening its relationship with the U.S. because of the negotiations. We see this and we say, okay, so now they need a security pact with the Iranians and other countries, and that's true. But as they move towards Iran, they need counterbalances, obviously, and it may be diplomatic channels or something else. Tell us how that kind of works.
Realizing that the U.S. is not reliable in the mid to long term doesn't mean you can just throw them out in the short term. And different Gulf states have different approaches to this. The US is probably the closest ally or partner that the US has in this part of the world, in the Gulf. Most reliable, less antagonistic, because you have episodes where the Saudis defying US demands, and you had UAE, there are episodes where the UAE do their own thing against US interests, whether it's in vis-a-vis China or Russia, or even in Africa, in Saudi as well. With OPEC, they've done things that defy, and the US. I think Qatar under Tamim has never defied America in any way. So in many ways, some people are saying the Qataris have put all their eggs in the US basket. They're almost acting like the 51st state. As a force multiplier. But as a force multiplier for the US, arguably still the only superpower, at least the most powerful country in the world at the moment, despite everything. And so, and they can't act in the Middle East without Qatar. They couldn't have done anything in Gaza or with Iran, in Afghanistan, and so on and so forth. And being that sort of force multiplier gives the Qataris immense leverage in Washington, and immense leverage, obviously, also in the region. Because if you look at Oman and Qatar, that's actually quite interesting. Both of them have a relationship with Iran. The Omanis for a very long time. Omanis have been dealing with the Persians for hundreds of years. They have a long history of fighting them, but also a long history of negotiating with them. What the Omanis are lacking, though, is the intimacy and the networks in Washington that the Qataris have. And so the Qataris are able to use that leverage to also get something in mediation or negotiating with local powers, because they have the US as a force multiplier in the background. And when I'm talking about force multiplier, it's not about the military power at all. I actually don't think Al Udeid in any way plays a role in this, because this is about the diplomatic lever of power. It's about network power. Network power doesn't rely on the military. And I would also say that the Qataris have probably not much to gain from having Al Udeid at this point. I think their networks and entanglement, their interdependence with regional
and it seems like the US doesn't have much to gain from having Al Udeid.
No, I think yes, I think they do, because it's an aircraft carrier, in many ways. You still, because what you can do from Israel is very limited as opposed to what you can do in Qatar. But if you want to do something from Qatar, you also need to be able to use that base. And the Qataris have basically on multiple occasions now said no, because it doesn't serve our national interest. And so it's a negotiation tool. But ultimately, the Qataris have built that network power that they can use with other local, state and non-state actors, and can use it then vis-a-vis the US. And also they've elevated the Qataris to immense power even in Europe. I mean, the Europeans are a third party to all of this, but they have a vested interest in Strait of Hormuz, a vested interest into deconflicting with Iran, and they're calling the Qataris, because the Qataris are able to also, have influence over the United States in a way that no one else has. And it's not through lobbying, it's not through coercion, it's not transactional sort of leverage. Because people always say, oh, Qatar and Israel, they're the same, aren't they? Because they both have influence over Washington. The influence that the Israelis are using is coercive. It's transactional. It's through payment, accommodation, or through coercion. The Qatari approach is actually not financial lobbying. It's basically saying, look, we can offer you certain means of statecraft, and we're willing to do it for you. it's consensual. And building consensus is, certainly is influence, but it's far more robust than a coercive approach to lobbying. It's something that is, it doesn't work against your inner feeling. It's something that kind of, is not in conflict with your own views. And so that's what the Qataris have established in this context. It makes them secure, but it's not bulletproof, as we've seen in this war. Qatar was attacked. The attack on Al Udeid, whether the train was owned by a US company or not, doesn't really matter. I mean, it took out a massive amount of money. And Qatar is also suffering from not being able to use the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, they're very much victimized in this conflict as well. But there is something about strategic culture in Qatar where the Qataris have an approach of not holding grudges, being pragmatic, and obviously still being such a small community that is so well endowed that despite the economic damage, the Qataris actually were able to sail through this with a few budgetary cuts here and there, but they didn't have to liquidate massive funds. So it gives them a luxury and breathing space to do things and think outside the box that, for example, Bahrain doesn't have or Kuwait doesn't have, and in many ways even Oman doesn't have. And hence why the Qatari case is a very unique one, because they are indispensable. And that's what they always wanted as a small state. They wanted to be seen as indispensable within the greater concert of international affairs. And they very much achieved this with this conflict as well.
Okay, so Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia's response to the war, many people, because like you said, there's a narrative war and then there's what's actually happening on the table. So in the narrative war, there was all sorts of various reports been planted in various media that MBS was, very pro taking out Tehran, and then there'd be other media reports later on that would be less of that view. What's from your reading and from your understanding and from the networks you have, what has Saudi Arabia's skin in this war been, and where does it stand now in terms of the fact that we're moving out of the war? Where does it stand now in terms of the regional order?
So going to the point, I think this was information that was leaked by pro-Israel outlets and journalists in February, where someone allegedly said in Washington, I remember it was Khalid bin Salman on one occasion, I think, the brother of Mohammed bin Salman and kind of the strategic mastermind in Washington, who allegedly said, we want them to take the regime out. I think what he actually said, for people I know who've been at the event, he said something along the lines of, if they go to war, they have to finish the job. We don't want them to start the war and then just pull out, which is kind of what happened in many ways, and leaving the whole situation dangling. But on no occasion from my networks in Saudi Arabia, on no occasions anyone in Saudi said, well, let's go in and let's fight them. I think that even in Abu Dhabi, despite all the defiance, strategically speaking, it makes no sense. This war doesn't serve the Gulf. It doesn't serve their energy interest or their prosperity interest or their Agenda 2030, whatever. So Saudis didn't want the war. They were not less victimized than everyone else. They might in some ways have benefited from the war as well, because they become indispensable for the smaller abutting states around the Persian Gulf, because Saudi Arabia can bypass the Strait of Hormuz. They have now pipelines that allow them to basically pump their oil into Jeddah and then trade it through the Bab al-Mandab. With the Bab al-Mandab as well, it's quite clear that the Houthis, they were able to contain the Houthis via Oman, via paying salaries in Sana'a in Yemen. So Saudi was somewhat better off than others. And they've also shown in that competition with the UAE that they are kind of a logistics hub. Their networks and their supply chains are more resilient, more robust than those of the UAE, because of where the UAE is. And Saudi Arabia has strategic depth just in terms of the sheer size of geography. And so in many ways for Saudi Arabia, that was a way to also show, look, we are a very profitable market, and we're a resilient market, and we can attract foreign investment. And I think a lot of logisticians who would have bet on the UAE prior to this war are now betting on Saudi Arabia. And so that's probably a positive for the Saudis. But ultimately, conflict is not in Saudi's interest at all. They would like to see, and they've maintained, by the way, a relationship with Iran throughout the war. Yes, they kicked out, I think, their ambassador at some point, but the embassy remained open. There have been formal contacts with the Iranians. The problem with Saudi Arabia right now is a degree of strategic drift. So, speaking to senior Gulfis from Qatar, Kuwait, also Bahrain, and even from Oman, they're all saying we want Saudi to take a lead. We want them to lead on this. We recognize that they are the big brother. And even if we at times we do our own thing as smaller states, the larger regional brother is Saudi Arabia. They're the leader of the Gulf. And a lot of the countries want the Saudis to take a lead on it, and everyone else will plug in to whatever the Saudis are doing. The problem is, from the Saudis, there's very little happening at the moment in terms of a clear agenda. They're saying we want entanglement, we want we want engagement with the Iranians. We are all prisoners of geography, but they're not very agile. And I think we talked about this when we talked about the conflict between the UAE and Saudi and Yemen. The agility is sometimes lacking in Saudi Arabia. So they're like an oil tanker that moves very, very slowly when they steer. And at the moment, every day there are new developments. So you need to be very agile. You have to be on your feet. You have to make decisions very quickly. And the Saudis are not very good at that. Ultimately, though, this war is an opportunity for Saudi Arabia to rebuild its posture in the region, as everything is crumbling down, this old regional order. And the multipolar order that's being built at the moment would see Saudi Arabia as being one pole vis-a-vis Israel, vis-a-vis Iran, vis-a-vis Turkey. And the Arab Gulf states want Saudi Arabia to play that role. And Saudi Arabia is willing to take it on, but they're not coming to terms with the fact of coming up with a strategy of actually how to do it. So the Qataris, again, being a force multiplier in all of this. The Qataris have received the legitimacy very early on from the Saudis and the endorsement from the Saudis to lead on this. And there's trust in Riyadh now, in Doha's capabilities to do what's in Saudi interests. And the Qataris are quite happy to play that role. So we're miles away from where we were during the blockade, where there was friction. I think in terms of intimacy, I would probably say that Qatari-Saudi relations now are better than they were in the years following up to, or following, leading up to the blockade. And that's remarkable. Mutual trust. And the Qataris very happy to empower the Saudis as well, of saying, okay, we're small, they're big. Very different to the UAE, who will still say, we're not small, we're a middle power, we're competing with the Saudis as another middle power. And there's a bit of this cognitive dissonance in Abu Dhabi that doesn't exist in the other Gulf states. So they're quite happy for Saudi to take the lead, but they need Saudi to come and lead, actually, rather than waiting and seeing and being risk averse. I mean, there's a lot of risk aversion in the Saudi approach. What is a positive, I think now, is the Riyadh approach of saying we need a collective, outside of the US-Iranian MOU negotiation process, we need to have a Gulf-Iranian rapprochement. We need to maybe come up with a framework that includes Iran, which is something the Iranians have been pushing for years and years. Obviously, more moderate people who are no longer in power are nowhere to be seen, like Zarif, who used to be the former foreign minister of Iran, has made that case. I think that's something that is a positive. I think that's the only way out of this quagmire. But also at the same time, there are grievances in the Gulf because they've been victimized. There have been massive billions of damage caused as well. And the Iranians saying, we want money, we want compensation from Iran. From the Gulf states, and the Gulf states are saying we actually want compensation from Iran for the damage that was done. So it's not just, again, a switch and a single summit and everything is back to normal. I think it will take years and years and years to rebuild that trust. But the Saudis are willing to lead. And why do they want Saudi to lead on this? Is because the choice that you have as an Arab state, as an Arab Gulf state, is you've got two pariahs, Iran and Israel. And they have two competing visions. One is UAE is Iran-centric, the other one is Israel-centric. And Saudi Arabia doesn't want to be in either of these. So there is an interest for Arab Gulf states, for Arab states in general, to build a new Saudi-led, Arab-led counterpole to these two competing visions, which is one that also involves and taps into Pakistan. It involves building a relationship with Turkey. That I think that it's a Saudi vision. They haven't filled it with any content, but that's sort of what they're propagating. That's where the narrative is going, and that's where thinking in Riyadh is going as well. I think that is a very, very positive thing that ultimately I think even the UAE will have to understand. Tahnoun bin Zayed certainly understands it, but even MBZ will ultimately understand that the idea of an Israeli-UAE alignment is an illusion. There is no Abrahamic coalition or Abrahamic vision for the region, because Israel has shown that despite some tactical, in many ways they're a bull in a china shop, That approach of being able to destroy something, having that destructive power alone is not enough to build an order. Order requires obviously a bit of coercion, but mostly has to be built around consensus, legitimacy. Israel has none of that. And I think from a UAE point of view, they're realizing actually, yes, getting something from Israel is great, getting some tech, getting some defense capability is great. But ultimately, it cannot build an order that people will plug into. And if you're in Jordan, if you're in Egypt, if you're in Turkey, if you're in Pakistan, that's not the order you want. But you also don't want the axis of resistance Iranian order, because that's a terrible order as well. It's built around Shiaism. So if you're in Saudi Arabia, ideologically a competitor, non-state actors empowering non-state actors, the axis of resistance is again something that very much undermines the understanding of sovereignty in Saudi Arabia. So you wouldn't endorse that either. And so the Saudis again have a unique moment. Like I said earlier, the Iranians have a unique moment to build something and establish their power, but the Saudis have an equally unique moment to lead on an Arab-Sunni coalition where others are willing to support, to kind of build, for MBS to kind of build a future posture for himself, which is built on consensus rather than coercion, which kind of, in many ways, takes him out of where he was in 2015 to 2018 when he killed, Khashoggi or all these other sort of impulsive decisions like the war in Yemen, the blockade on Qatar, all that stuff that really tarnished his reputation early on. This is a way for him to bounce back and say, look, I can lead on this. But we haven't seen anything tangible at the moment.
Okay, so you brought up Turkey and Pakistan, and you brought up sort of, now there's been a security pact with Turkey, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia, and the other big player in the region would be Egypt. Egypt, is kind of now is almost I wouldn't say a state of Saudi Arabia, but it's aligned largely to Saudi Arabia, but it still has its own foreign policy to some extent. How do you see that sort of becoming more entrenched? It sounds like there's natural drift towards that, but do you see, because I mean, things are moving so quickly in this region, right? When I first spoke to you in November, we talked about Sudan, and yes, it wasn't sustainable that the UAE's networked disruption and chaos and genocide in Sudan was going to continue, but at the time, it is
continuing.
Exactly, it is continuing, right? So things don't change. There are definitely still remnants of prior sort of the status quo in the region. So where's that relationship? But also, is that naturally gonna leave or open the gates towards a Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Iran relationship?
There's going to be a relationship. So that multipolar order is one that is multipolar and built on interdependence in all directions, horizontal, vertical. There's probably not a vertical, everything is horizontal.
Yes.
Because no one is a hegemon, no one is dictating the terms. Even if the Iranians are trying to do it, there are limits to what Iran can do outside of its immediate vicinity. So obviously, if you sit in the Arab Gulf states, that you're the direct geographic vicinity of Iran, and you can be victimized. But you move out further away from it, even in the western part of Saudi Arabia, you're out of that direct vicinity where I think Iran will struggle to impose its will. So if Iran really wants to be part of an interactive, integral part to this order, they will have to reach out as well on horizontal terms. And Saudi Arabia is not likely going to be a key connector in all of that. We talked about that network building capability of the UAE, which is built around non-state actors. It's what I call the axis of secessionist. That axis is still there, and it's still breathing. The UAE, despite them being victimized, despite the fact that they're unable to attract capital, the ability, looking at Dubai's economy struggling, despite all of this, money, weapons, material support to the RSF keeps on flying, and it keeps on going, and it keeps going from the UAE to Sudan, despite everything. They're still acting very much in Libya, where the UAE are still in the driver's seat. Somalia movement. In Yemen, the SDC is still where it is in many ways, in terms of they maintain their networks on the ground. They're able to cause a lot of disruption to the Saudi effort. They're able to mobilize quite a lot of people and grievances in the south. And so the UAE, by extension, has maintained their influence there as well. So it's not like the UAE's axis has in any way been diminished by this war, quite the contrary. The question is, what good is it if you're being victimized? The axis has not helped the UAE to stay safe. So it's not a project actually to build security in the for Abu Dhabi in the way that the axis of resistance has been able to build some sort of security for Iran. Saudi Arabia still has not has anything in it, to compete with that Saudi axis. With that Emirati axis. So Saudi Arabia is still struggling in many ways to come up to actually generate influence outside of its borders.
But it's probably why the other GCC countries wanted to take the lead. They see it as a more reliable, trustworthy, less malicious actor.
And it plays within the confines of international law. It has a similar vision for sovereignty and stability like other Gulf states have. So I'm not advocating for Saudi Arabia to build its own axis of non-state actors, obviously. But I'm saying that what we need to do, what Saudi Arabia needs to do, it needs to build alliances and networks of other sorts in other parts of the region. Yemen for them is their own home turf, and hence why they're so invested in it. But in terms of expeditionary capability, Saudi Arabia doesn't have a tradition of expeditionary statecraft outside of its borders, exception being Afghanistan in the 1980s. But it's in Syria as well, Saudi is playing some role, but there's another issue that we need to bear in mind is Saudi Arabia has economic issues. There isn't that much money in the coffers at the moment that could go around to help with development and building, even in Lebanon, the sort of financial interdependence that is required to build state building, nation building. It requires money that Saudi doesn't have, is unwilling to spend outside of the kingdom. And so they are relying, they need force multipliers. Qatar could be a force multiplier. I think in Lebanon, what the Qataris have done on the surface with the Lebanese armed forces of paying salaries, they're doing that very in close alignment and cooperation with the Saudis, and that works in Saudi's favor. What they're doing in terms of energy in Syria, again, the Qataris are in that space. And you'd asked me 10 years ago or 8 years ago, I would have said, yeah, that's competitive. Saudi is competing with Qatar, Qatar competing with Saudi. That's no longer the case. The Qataris are quite happy to do and to deconflict with the Saudis and find ways to do things that serve Saudi interests as well. Because it makes Qatar relevant, right? Qatar, again, being that little agile player that can consume power and also elevate itself by becoming a force multiplier to others. When you look at Egypt as well, Saudi isn't the big player that they could be. I mean, yes, there's money going into Egypt, but it's going from Saudi reluctantly because they know it's a black hole. Money going into Egypt sort of evaporates in this immensely corrupt regime of Sisi. One white elephant being built next to the other, which doesn't really serve national interest. It serves regime interest. And obviously, Egypt is an unstable country, and it has become a beggar state in many ways because of the Sisi regime, a beggar state that is taking money and begging for money from Qatar, from UAE, from Saudi. The fact that Sisi had to make a visit to Abu Dhabi to say, look, here, we're sending you some airplanes to defend the UAE, is because the UAE is the main debtor to and guarantor, financial guarantor of Egypt, despite the fact that the Egyptians are also taking money from everyone else. That is not usually a foundation to become a powerful country because you're actually beholden to someone else. And it doesn't matter that you have 100 million people. Egypt is still the most populous country in the Arab world, but they're just unable to kind of build their own strategy autonomously. So there's no sovereignty really in terms of Egyptian decision making, and this is why the center of gravity has really pivoted away from other parts like Egypt to the Gulf. This is where the power is. Probably Israel is the only counterpole to that. Because you look at Iran and the GCC, they are clearly the main players in the region, plus Israel, which is not in the Gulf. But the Gulf is where the center of gravity is in terms of power.
Okay, Iraq, Iraq, like you say, there was a very small chance, maybe you put at 5% or less than 10%, that there could have been a lot of instability in Iran. That would have devastated Iraq.
Mm-hmm. Iraq is already devastated.
That is true, devastated further. Right, where is Iraq in all of this? Because obviously it's very close to Iran. It needs to be very close to Iran. It is overrun still with remnants of its own war and the war with Syria, the war in Syria rather. Just what's the status of Iraq right now?
No, how
does this war impacted the wrapping up of the war?
I think this, and we're seeing this. First of all, in terms of territorial integrity and sovereignty, Iraq has been victimized and violated in many ways by Israel. Not just because of the penetration of their airspace, but we know of one major base that the Israelis have built in Iraq, We know, and there were likely more than that. They're likely more in Kurdistan as well, in the KRG Mossad operation, forward operating bases. So, and the same has been done by the Iranians. So in many ways, the ground zero for this war between Israel and Iran has shifted very much to Iraq.
How does that happen, though? I mean, before you continue, how do you as a government build another base in another country covertly?
Well,
it's hard, right?
There's a lot of empty empty areas, empty space in Iraq, and it's certainly not Israeli trucks or planes or whatever going over there. This is done with Israel through the US and US power, and the US have bases in all of these countries. They have networks, logisticians in all of the countries, and whether it's from Jordan or from Kuwait or from Iraq itself, they can bring stuff into the country. And we've also seen this in this war is the way that the US has disregarded the sovereignty of their partners, the way that they've used the GCC states as staging grounds to fire missiles, for example, from Kuwait or Bahrain into Iran, despite the fact that both the Bahrainis and the Kuwaitis have said don't do it. The fact that they've been flying material into GCC countries, including Kuwait, without getting a green light from the host state, shows that there's massive disrespect from Washington and the way that they deal almost in a colonial way with these local countries who invest trillions of dollars in the US, who are extremely influential. And I wouldn't be surprised, and the same is true for Jordan, where the US would, very much not just overstay their welcome, but in many ways exploit that intimate relationship that they have to serve their own interests and furthering the interests of Israel. That in itself is unheard of, and no way that Israel could have done it on its own. It does it via the United States, especially in terms of material power, getting it in there, getting the jamming, also intelligence-wise, how creating counterintelligence to kind of undermine the ability to be detected. All of that required U.S. help. So the Israelis have built their bases in Iraq, and the Iranians have had their bases in Iraq for a long time. And I think the PMUs, or PMF, whatever you call them, the Hashd al-Shabi, these Iranian-aligned networks of non-state actors who are kind of semi-integrated into the Iraqi state, they are the main part of the axis of resistance that is still very much alive and kicking, and haven't been degraded, have been empowered in terms of their ideology and legitimacy in many ways, have now new capabilities, not as close as Hezbollah to Israel, but still equally fairly close. And this is why the Israelis have now redirected their focus on Iraq, saying the next war might be, and has already started, against proxies and the axis of resistance in Iraq. And equally, the Iranians know that this is a great staging ground in terms of their campfire strategy of delegating the burden of conflict as far away from their own borders into a neighboring country, which is now Iraq. And then you look at how much fire has been gone into Kuwait and Saudi Arabia from Iraq, quite a lot actually. So the Iranians have used their bases or their proxies in Iraq to do that. And so for Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, this is another problem where they now need to realign their thinking about air defense and potentially forward defense as well into Iraq. And in all of that, Iraqi sovereignty is being violated. You have a new prime minister now who is, at least on the surface, seems to be not Iran aligned. Is certainly a better alternative to someone like Nouri al-Maliki, who's very much an Iranian proxy. But it's still someone that over time in that system, and that's the problem in the system of Iraq, Iran is so deeply invested, deeply integrated into the system of Iraq, that over time, if you're a bureaucrat or you're a leader in Iraq, you eventually realize there's only that much you can do to defy Iran. Eventually you have to come around and work with the Iranians. And so over time, there is this risk that Zaidi might also fall into that camp. Then there is some in Saudi are a bit suspicious of Zaidi because he obviously was a businessman. He's been Most businessmen have had dealings through the UAE, because that's the hub where things happen. And so there have been some allegations on social media of him being maybe too close to the Emiratis. I don't see any of that. But there is, again, there is a lot of stuff happening where, the Gulf states don't really know if that's the guy they can do business with. And there's a suspicion that prime ministers, they come and go in Iraq, and they start off as being, seem on the surface, good alternatives to a pro-Iranian candidate, but then over time have to accommodate the Iranians to stay in power. And no strategy or policy on the side of the GCC to actually do something with Iraq, because what really needs to happen, and I hope that this war is an eye-opener for that, for Saudi and for Kuwait, for example, in particular, because they are so close to Iraq, to maybe build financial entanglement with local communities in the south of Iraq. That would be a game changer, because ultimately the only way you get Iran out is by providing local communities in Iraq with an alternative to Iranian money. And that money or investment or development aid could come from the Gulf. And it wouldn't be much. It wouldn't have to be billions and billions of dollars, but a few hundred millions in terms of one of the interesting projects was one of building a power grid that integrates Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Iraqi power grids. It will have positive ripple effects for local communities. That's that sort of stuff. Investing into infrastructure in the southern parts of Iraq would make people have less grievances, because what Iran is thriving on is grievances, social grievances. That's what it's not just sectarianism. And they're able to provide just a little bit, as they do in Lebanon, to aggrieved communities. You take these grievances away, the idea of resistance becomes suddenly very unattractive. And so there's been some thinking in Saudi and in Kuwait over the last couple of months of saying maybe we can do more rather than just a military approach to Iraq. Maybe there's a social political approach that we can take.
Okay. Specifically, I mean, Syria has been impacted in the war in a number of ways, as they always are, but specifically they've been impacted because of Lebanon and because of Israel's, real destruction of a large part of southern Lebanon. They obviously were, I'm assuming, hoping there'd be no war. The war has come and came. Sharaa was already, had a very tenuous job. He needed to kind of relieve sanctions. He needed to ally with Israel in order to sustain his power, create alliances with Turkey. I mean, Turkey to a large extent has empowered him, and with Saudi Arabia and Qatar. There's still always the element of militias and sectarianism rising. How tricky has this been for Syria and for Sharaa, and how do you see the Syrians navigating the post-war sort of status quo?
The post-Iran war?
The post-Iran war status quo, yes.
I think Syria is still one of the most interesting markets, again, looking at it through the lens of markets and development in the region. There is a lot of instability, and there's a lot of things that we usually don't see when we look at traditional development scales and overviews, where we're saying, okay, the state is not a unitary one. There is competing power sources. There is a lot of non-state actors not integrating into the state bureaucracy. But despite the insecurity and unpredictability that comes with it, it's still a fairly united country. It has a immense potential economically, socially, a lot of potential for growth as well, because after years and years of conflict, there is a country that is likely going to be very successful in a few years' time, and a market that is completely underinvested. So you can buy stakes in that project very early on. And so you mentioned Saudi and Qatar going in, but Emirati companies as well, and Emirati sovereign capital, but also private equity is going in. And so the progress has been fairly positive, and there's obviously a lot of Turkish equity going into Syria as well, because people believe in the geography of Syria. Despite all the insecurities that Syria has, Syria is just positioned in such an interesting geostrategic space, also becoming potentially quite relevant if you are trying to bypass the Strait of Hormuz, which I would caveat and say there isn't a way to get completely to not rely on Hormuz 100%. That's not going to happen. But there are alternatives. So alternative supply routes and pipeline routes from Kuwait or from Qatar going through Iraq and Syria. These are things that people are looking into. So in terms of energy security, in terms of trade corridors as well, alternative trade corridors going from the Gulf through Syria or Iraq and Syria through the Mediterranean. So Syria has all that to offer. I think the greatest problem still is Israel along the border, because Israel sees Turkish influence as a major threat. And there's this narrative being built up now, this sort of scarecrow of after Iran, it has to be Turkey, which is completely bonkers, obviously. And I think the Turks are not necessarily taking it seriously. It's not going to be an overt war, but they're seeing al-Shara as a proxy of Turkey. And so they're saying Turkey's now on our doorstep. And that sort of, scarecrow of the Muslim Brotherhood, Turkey, is now right on our doorstep. And so the Israelis are selling this to themselves for a security reason, selling it to the world and to their networks of saying, we need to have a foothold in Syria in the south. We need to have a buffer zone there, although that buffer zone is a buffer zone of the buffer zone they already created in 1973 with the occupation of the Golan Heights. But they're selling it to themselves and selling it to the hardline ideologues who want a greater Israel. Is like, we need to have that territory. But the IDF sells it to itself as saying we need that buffer zone because al-Shara can't be trusted and he's a proxy of Turkey in that way. That in its and them meddling and trying to engineer the social fabric by engaging with minorities such as all kinds of minorities, especially Christian minorities. This is something that engineering that Israel is doing in the south is potentially problematic. And it could be its source, and that's what they're doing. It's a subversive approach to undermine al-Shara's sort of statehood, presidency, and legitimacy domestically as well. That I think is a problem moving forward. The Syrians need this problem to go away, but ultimately, I think this war has also a lot of opportunities because Syria is seen as a better alternative to Iraq. It does have a lot going for itself, and there is now political global consensus that al-Shara is the guy. US support is important. European support is important. I think even the Russians are coming around. The Chinese are coming around. So there is great power interest to make sure that Syria is a success story. And hence why I'm a bit more optimistic than I am with Iraq or Egypt or other players.
Okay. I mean, a lot of what we've spoken about now, it's all occurred because of Israel's, massive bombardment on Gaza and its genocide there. I mean, its degradation of Hezbollah brought Shara to power. Israel has, to a large extent, it's not just the immediate dragging of Trump into Iran, it's the gradual dragging of the U.S. state into engaging Iran that really begun or accelerated at least once Israel started in a post October 7th environment. So Israel has, degraded Hamas. It has genocided Gaza. It has destroyed Palestinian life to a large extent, and it has destroyed a lot of Lebanese life and Lebanese infrastructure. But it's clear now. It's becoming clear that strategically they've just been walking into one blunder into another. I mean, it's blunder after blunder after blunder. They also, you mentioned Ben Gvir and Smotrich, the Netanyahu government, the fact that more than 90% of the population, are against the MOU. How does Israel stop itself from, walking into destruction or walking into a relationship with its neighbors that is completely unsustainable, which eventually weakens its own ability to, function and exist and remain and collaborate and normalize in the region?
Israel has been in a spiral of self-victimization since its inception. It builds on Jewish victimhood, but then has tried to replace Jewish victimhood with a forward defense of saying we never want to be victims again after the experience of the Holocaust. We want to be on the forefront. We want to answer any sort of victimization with strength, and preemptive strength as well, overusing, disproportionate use of force to basically say we are actually strong. Ultimately, Israel is a small state. It has no strategic depth. It's inherently insecure in terms of where it is positioned. It's insane for a country like this and of that size, surrounded by, in the way that it is surrounded from all sides by Arab and Muslim majority countries, not to have constructive relationships with its partners. Because even the relationship with Egypt and Jordan has been very much on hold.
It's a coercive relationship.
It's a coercive one, but it exists on paper. It's no longer one that is in any way bearing any fruit. So they can't really rely on that. And just depending on what Israel is doing next, we can't rule out fundamentally that Egypt and Jordan are not taking some action against Israel if they're going on that trajectory. There are red lines, they might be crossed, and the Egyptians, the Jordanians might take action. So Israel is completely isolated globally. It's completely isolated in the region. I can't think of maybe, apartheid South Africa. But apartheid South Africa wasn't a small state surrounded by much stronger states. But Israel is so isolated. I can't think of any other player that has no connections to the outside world or no connections to its immediate neighborhood. And obviously the Israelis will blame the Arabs for that, saying, oh yeah, we always wanted it, but they never wanted. But if you look at the reality of the fact is they've never really made a constructive effort, because if you see everything as a threat, everything as a challenge rather than an opportunity, you have that sort of bunker mentality of digging yourself in, of saying, I'm surrounded by baddies who are trying to kill me, so I have to kill them first. And that exists in Israeli strategic culture. There's a lot of writing on it. But it has been amplified tenfold or more across Israeli society since the 7th of October. And you speak to Israelis about this, people who I would have considered to be sort of centrists, balanced, who are saying, we have no choice in Gaza but kill this sort of massive, they really have amplified Hamas into a larger than life sort of actor that wanted to commit genocide in Israel. And if that mentality means that they can't see beyond the threat, same with Hezbollah. Hezbollah is seen as the most challenging, fundamental, existential threat to Israel. And I'm not saying they're not, but there are ways out of it. And the one way out of all of these problems is diplomatic. It's political. It's engagement rather than confrontation. And, and I've said it many times, Israel is just a hammer that sees everything as a nail. Everything has to be hammered. And you have a problem, you deal with it through coercion, not through consensus. It's coercion externally, the way that, and I think the problem isn't just, we're looking at the regional context. Ultimately, Israel hasn't even been able to maintain a consensual relationship with its most important security guarantor, which is the United States. Their approach to Trump and the deal, the approach to J.D. Vance has been one of coercion. The way that weaponized narratives, the pro-Israel lobby, against Trump, they're digging themselves. I mean, for me, it's mind-boggling. I can't understand what the thinking is behind it. Do they think they can coerce Trump into surrendering and saying, okay, sorry, too much pressure from Israel, we'll have to go back and do whatever Israel's purpose is? The multiple times Trump has told Netanyahu to stop, and Netanyahu still uses the collective lobby to kind of attack Trump. That sort of a coercive approach is completely counterproductive. Israel is sitting already in a hole that they can't get themselves out of by themselves, and they keep on digging and digging and digging. And a lot of the regional players are looking at this and shaking their head, because, to be honest, there is a readiness now in the Arab world that didn't exist in the 90s or in the 2000s, when Israel was a far more normal country, despite all its flaws. There's now a consensus to saying, actually, we're quite willing to build a relationship. We're now in a very rare moment of catastrophe where something has been broken, and once something breaks, there are opportunities to build something. And now something has been broken. There's an opportunity to rebuild. And rebuilding, I'm not just talking infrastructure, I'm talking rebuilding relationships, building a new order. There is an opportunity for Israel, if it was acting like a normal country, to have a relationship with the Arab world, and not just with the UAE and the Abraham Accords, but being a constructive, integrated element to that regional order. There is that opportunity. But the Israelis don't see it. And it's not Netanyahu, it's not Smotrich, it's not Ben-Gvir. You look at Bennett, you even look at Yair Lapid, who certainly was centrist, maybe even center-left at some point. Their narrative isn't very different. It's still Hezbollah, Hamas, Syria, Turkey, Iran. So all this sort of threat environment that they have built up cognitively, which is not necessarily always built on facts, that is being shared quite widely across Israeli society. And it's trauma. It's a traumatized country, and that trauma about the 7th of October has been amplified so much that it's been internalized. It's social psychological trauma. It's not individual trauma. And so usually when you're in that sort of trauma space, what you need is therapy. And I don't know who's been able to help the Israelis with that. You see the way that they write, the pro-Israel lobby is writing about, they can't understand how others see things differently. They can't understand how the Western world sees things differently, how the Americans see Israeli behavior as counterproductive, how the Europeans see Israeli behavior as counterproductive. And I think what broke the camel's back was really this attack on Iran. For many in Europe, many of those people who have traditionally sided with Israel have said enough is enough. They said, okay, that you killed 50,000 children in Gaza, that was bad, but we didn't care that much. But when it came to their tangible trading interests, money, prosperity, because we in Europe are the ones suffering the most from Strait of Hormuz, energy crisis, cost of living, that was enough. And so a lot of the people who used to be quite aligned with Israel have now gone back and said this it's absolutely unacceptable. And Israel has lost goodwill across the political spectrum in the West, in Europe, in the United States. I think that's far more problematic than what they've destroyed in the region itself. So here is a country that is teeny tiny, relies, almost the entire power is underwritten by outside powers like the United States. And instead of rebuilding that, they're doubling down and destroying it and digging themselves an ever deeper hole. And that in itself is a trajectory that I think Israel will not emerge from. If you then look at the Palestinian issue, again, I'm not even looking at it from the Palestinians' point of view. It's just common sense. You're occupying ever more territory. You're creating more grievances in a community, in the Palestinian community. You're taking away land, livelihood, ever more than you already have done in an already, the Palestinian very traumatized community itself. And you what you do by doing that, you absorb more burden, social-political burden, counterinsurgency burden onto yourself at a time when you're already being pressured from the outside because you basically have violated the sovereignty of I think it's now 8 different countries over the last 3 years. And then internally, you have a demographic problem where ever smaller amount of people have to control an ever bigger territory and an ever bigger amount of people. The disproportionate burden on Israel is just increasing. And you're doing that without having an off-ramp, because you're saying, okay, two-state solution is dead. We'll have a one-state solution. You want to have a one-state solution where the vast majority, where the demographics suggest that over the years, there will be far more Muslims, Arabs, Christians in your territory than Jews. If you look at the demographics, occupying the territory and internalizing that territory into Israel proper is completely against your interest. And there is no force of coercion, no automated self-shooting robotic system that can keep that apartheid oppression of Palestinians alive. It just makes no sense. I'm leaving all the ethics out of it. So Israel, in the trajectory that Israel is going, economically, socially, demographically, and then there are all these internal frictions within Israel. And as soon as the war is calming down a little bit, they're rallying around the flag that you might have experienced over the last 3 years, which is the longest war in Israel's history. That rallying around the flag of this very diverse, even Jewish country, might all fall apart. If I look at the trajectory of Israel, it's not a country that might exist in the same way it exists today in the next 20 or 30 years. And there's a lot of people in the Arab world who are now looking at it and saying, actually, why should we normalize just to score some short-term credits with Trump, when really the country in itself, Israel, is not normal. It has to normalize first. And it's potentially digging itself a hole that it can't come out of. And it might actually, that problem of Israel might solve itself because it's self-destructive. It's not one that is sustainable in any way.
Okay. Final question, and it's related to the one I've just had with you. You've mentioned that, when 20,000, I think you said 15,000, but when it's upwards of 20,000 Palestinian children were killed.
I said 50.
You said 50.
Yeah, we don't know. I don't know.
We don't know. I mean, it could well be 50, but official reports of 21,000, I think, children being killed. Couldn't perturb the Europeans and parts of the US state, but closing Hormuz did. It was when the genocide in Gaza began, there was this criticism and there was this rallying call to be like, why? Iran could have closed Hormuz then. Arab countries could have stopped pumping oil. There's many deterrents they could have put in place. Now, they also will probably, I'm sure they did not contemplate that, but they have their own reasons, cowardice, concern, fear, suspicion, to why they didn't. But the fact that now Iran has pulled the lever of Hormuz, do you not think that now shows them retrospectively that actually there's a lot of economic power that this bloc, either as one bloc, Iranians and the Arab states, or individually, do have to have a coercive power on the way states conduct themselves in the region?
Absolutely. I don't think this war is a... There's a lot of hatred towards the Gulf states on social media or in the public domain from other Arabs and other Muslims of saying, they've just stood by idly when Gaza happened. They stood by idly when Iran happened. And they haven't. They just are not necessarily aware of the levers they have and how to pull them. More could have been done, I think, using the energy lever themselves. But let's just look at GCC in Iran as well, because there is this distorted image of saying the GCC has no choice, but they need to acquiesce to Iran and thereby giving up, they become vassal states of Iran. That's not true. If Iran wants to grow, if it wants sanctions lifted, if we say that ultimately the IGC has an interest for this to happen, then that can only happen through the Gulf states. The gateway to Iran is Oman, is UAE, is Qatar, maybe even Saudi Arabia. If they want to open up their market, investments will most likely come from these countries. These countries will buy a stake in Iran. That in itself is an incentive, transactional incentive for Iran to keep these friends quite close, or partners or neighbors or whatever you want to call them. And there's billions of dollars still frozen, obviously, across the Gulf of Iranian funds that will only get released if Iran is playing game. And they understand that. There is no unfreezing of assets until Iran is coming forward and not just negotiating in good faith, but actually at least keep the MOU alive and do what you agreed to in the MOU. These are incentives. In terms of interdependence as well, they have an aging energy infrastructure. Iran is one of the potentially biggest energy producers in the world, but they're still using 1970s technology in gas and oil to actually refine and build and produce the products and get them to market. Saudi, UAE, Qatari investments into that energy infrastructure will boost that economy. But they will only do it if they see themselves an incentive. So I think the IGC needs to understand that, yes, they have a lot of coercive power and disruptive power through drones and ballistic missiles. But ultimately, they have an interest in making sure that the Gulf states are secure because they're a lifeline themselves. That money is not going to come from the US or it's going to come from Europe. If it comes from private markets, these private markets need facilitators. And these facilitators of private markets are the Gulf states. Gulf states are the most closely connected to global financial markets. So if Iran wants this, there is their incentive. And ultimately, there is a military lever of power that the UAE have used, that the Saudis have tried to use. But collectively, I think the GCC is now on a shopping spree that is unprecedented. Unprecedented in a way of diversification, not just buying American products, but European products and Korean products and Ukrainian products, but also going out building joint ventures. You've got Sami in Saudi Arabia, you've got Edge in the UAE, you've got in Qatar the Bazan Group, which are sovereign holding companies that with sovereign equity that buy stakes and sometimes up entire businesses in the West in order to secure the defense supply chain that these countries constitute. And that in itself makes them major players, the Gulf countries, in European defense industry, US defense industry, and also gives them leverage because they will determine what will be produced where, and it will give them a stake in it. I think it will change the global defense industry. If you look at how much money is being unlocked now, trillions of dollars, I would suggest, are being unlocked right now in the defense industry. That is leverage, again, making that where a lot of defense contractors in the West are now looking at the Gulf as the future, whether they produce locally or produce in the West or wherever they are situated. That in itself means the Gulf will collectively build a massive military power and force, not just as a deterrent, but also potentially as a forward operational capability. If the Gulf finds, the GCC as an organization finds a way to actually pool this and integrate, and where there's a lot of friction and animosities within the GCC at the moment, so I'm not overly confident that the UAE and Saudi Arabia, for one, will just sit around the table and share capabilities and intelligence, because it's not happening. It's not happening across other Gulf states. We're at a very, very low level of integration, despite the fact that this is not the European Union or NATO. But if the GCC would bring it to the next level, where intelligence is shared, capability is shared, where countries effectively integrate their military forces, this would be a very, very powerful collective military force that could be used to deter Israel, to deter Iran. And it will, because there is so much money there, if it's done smartly, it would be something that is of global status. There is an opportunity here for the Gulf states to build leverage in that respect as well. So there's the economy, there is military, there's diplomacy as well, because the relationships that the Gulf states have globally, not just in the region, make them extremely indispensable. There's energy, obviously, we talked about that already. You take all these things combined, then the Gulf states are not victims in it. They're not vassal states of either Israel or Iran. The problem is realizing that the leverage is there and understanding how to unleash it and build on it. And I do think the only way this can be done is if they do it collectively rather than every country for their own. The UAE on their own will remain a small state aspiring to be a middle power. Kuwait is a small state, Oman is a small state, Qatar is a small state. Saudi might be more of a middle power, but on their own they're powerless. It's when they pool their power and they work together that they can have leverage. They also need to know how to use it. And I think that's, again, where the Gulf states have not done enough. If you think that they pledged $3.6 trillion in the United States, and where that money's come from, we can we can break it apart and we realize it's probably already money spent. Some of the money will never be spent. These are all MOUs, but we're still talking about trillions of dollars. That leverage, if that Gulf leverage had been used effectively on Trump and his sort of extremely corrupt group of friends around him, the Gulf states would have had more leverage early on to have impact on markets, but also directly impact Trump. They can change policy. And this goes back to what we said earlier. The battle between Israel and the Gulf lobby, that is going to determine Middle Eastern policy going forward. And the Gulf lobby, if acting collectively, as they have now towards the end of this conflict, is more powerful than the Israel lobby, more sustainable, because, as I said, it was built on consensus rather than just transactionalism. You take this together, the Gulf could, if they realize, become the player that will determine how the US will move and do things and do business in the region. And it doesn't have to be to the detriment of Israel. I don't think the Gulf states are, holding grudges. This is not the 1970s or 1960s where Gulfies are still thinking we need to wipe Israel off the map. I think that's not how people look at it. They're quite pragmatic about it. And if Israel was pragmatic, as it might have been in the 1990s, then there could be some sort of normalization. I just don't see it happening. And Israel needs to come to terms with the fact that the Gulf lobby is there to stay, and it's certainly far more powerful than they think it is.
Andreas Krieg, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Always a pleasure speaking with you.
Great pleasure.